Chapter 3 focuses on how to display and describe categorical data. While we're not going to cover chapters 1 and 2 together, one important concept that I do want to emphasize is the concept of the W's and adding context to data. For the entirety of the course, anytime we write an answer, we want to add context, meaning that we want to write our answer about whatever the topic that the question is on. That being said, we want to incorporate parts of the question in our answer, namely as many of the W's, who, what, where, when, why, how, as we can when we're crafting our answer. Before we talk about how we can display categorical data, let's talk about the two types of data that we can have. We have quantitative data. Now, in statistics, a lot of times there's some hints in the naming of these terms. So quantitative data is referring to quantities. These would be things like your height, your weight, your age, number of siblings you have, etc. It's any numerical variable. Okay. On the other hand, we have categorical data. That's what this chapter will be on. And a categorical variable is anything that can be broken down to categories. These are non-numerical variables like the color of your eyes, your hair color, your favorite football team, your place of birth, etc. So on this slide here, we have a categorical variable, which is the passengers aboard the Titanic and what class they were situated in, first class, second class, third class, or whether they were part of the crew. Now, since we can't split this into numbers, it's not a numerical variable, what we can do is count how many passengers were in each of those classes. Okay, so that's what we do in what's called a frequency table. We count up how many of each we have in those classes. Now, the difference between a frequency table and a relative frequency table is in a relative frequency table, we just switch each of these counts into percentages. So if we were to total up all of these counts, we get 2201. And if we take 325 and put it over 2201, first class passengers make up 14.77% of the total passengers. Okay, that's what a relative frequency table is. If we were interested in making a graphical display of the data on the previous slide, we have a limited number of options. We're going to learn about a number of different graphs in this class, but as far as categorical graphs go, there's really only two options. There's pie charts and there's bar charts, and both of those have to abide by what's called the area principle. So to explain the area principle, if we look at this slide here, the question is, how much bigger is the circle on the right compared to the circle on the left? Now, if you're going just by the diameter of the circle on the left is 1 unit, and the diameter of the circle on the right is 4 units. Okay, so based on that, the circle is 4 times as large. Now, our brains don't really see it like that. Our brains tend to view things by the area that it represents. And the area that this right circle takes up is a lot larger than 4 times as big as the circle on the left. So anytime we make a graph in statistics, we want to make sure that it follows the area principle, namely that the area that the display takes up corresponds with the actual magnitude of the data that it represents. So here's a display that violates the area principle. This is that data that was shown of the passengers on the Titanic. If you look at the smallest class, which is the second class group, we have 285. That's this ship here. Okay, largest one, the crew group, is this big one up here. That should be about 3 times as big, and it is if we look at it horizontally. Okay, but the area that that big ship takes up is a lot more than 3 times as big. So it kind of tricks our brain into thinking that the crew size is a lot larger than 3 times as big than that second class group. While using a photo of a boat looks a bit flashy and nice while creating a display for the Titanic, it's not an effective means of making a display for this course. So instead we keep it simple. We'll use, for categorical data, bar charts, pie charts. Those are our two options, and that's it. Both of those abide by the area principle provided they're made correctly. When it comes to a bar chart, the thing that we need to make note of is that all of these bars are the same width. That's very important. If these are not the same width, then it does not abide by the area principle. When we make a bar chart, categories go at the bottom, and then along the left side we have our frequency. Okay, so we can just go to the counts of each class. Okay, also this scale here, okay, anytime we draw a display, we want to make sure it's drawn to scale, and there really should be a title up here, okay, which is always the case for every display. Earlier on in this PowerPoint, I had mentioned that when we add the word relative in front of frequency, it changes our data from counts to percentages. So when we make a relative frequency bar chart, we just change our scale on the left from counts to percentages. The display looks exactly the same. Actually, I'm going to load up the display from the previous page, and you can see that these two graphs look identical with the exception that the scales are different. Okay, so changing from counts to percentages doesn't change the actual graph at all. It's just changing these scales on the side here. I know that you're familiar with pie charts, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. But the one thing I do want to note is that anytime you make a bar chart or a pie chart, you want to make sure that these categories do not overlap. Okay, what that means is that when we look at our passengers, a single passenger is going to be solely a crew member or solely in first class. In other words, it's not possible for a person to be both in first class and a crew member. Once we start having an overlap of our categories, neither of these displays is appropriate. So those are the two ways that we can display graphically a categorical variable. If we want to look at data, another option that we have is a contingency table. When we have a contingency table, we're actually looking at two variables at once. So in this contingency table here, we have class across the top, and then on the left side, we have survival, whether the passenger is alive or dead after the sinking of the Titanic. If we look in the crosshairs of this table, we can see, for example, there were 118 people in second class that survived. Okay, if we look across the table, we can see there were 711 people who survived. Right below that, 1,490 people who died. There were 706 people in third class. A marginal distribution is another one of these terms that has a hint in the name. And a marginal distribution is referring to the distribution along the margins. So the 711 and the 1490 is the marginal distribution of survival. So 711 passengers died, 1,490 passengers survived. We can switch both of those to percentages and we get their relative percentages. If we looked at these numbers across the bottom here, that would be the marginal distribution of passengers class. On the other hand, when we're finding a conditional distribution, we're narrowing down our population to a subset of our entire group based on some kind of condition. In this case, the fact that the passengers were alive after the sinking. So instead of looking at all 2,201 passengers on the Titanic, we only want to look at the 711 passengers that survived. Of those 711, 203 were in first class. 203 out of 711 gives us a conditional distribution of 28.6% in first class, 16.6% in second, etc., etc. Once again, this is the conditional distribution of the 711 passengers that survived the sinking of the Titanic. And let's look at these numbers a little more in depth at this point. And let's compare it to what we've been led to believe about the Titanic, namely that first class passengers were more likely to survive the sinking and third class and crew class were less likely to survive the sinking. When we look at these percentages, we really don't see that borne out. Okay, it looks fairly consistent, around 25%, with the exception of second class. Second class had the lowest percentage of survivors at 16.6. Crew class actually had the highest percentage. So we're not seeing that decrease as we go from first class, which we would expect to have the highest, down to crew, which we would expect to have the lowest. Now, this is a way where we can kind of use statistics to tell a false story, okay? Because everything we've heard about the sinking of the Titanic is true, and we don't see it until we look at the conditional distribution of the deceased, which is what we have here. So if we take the people who died in the Titanic, all 1,490, and we break them up by class. Okay, this is where we see that pattern. All right, so 8.2% of the first class passengers died. All right, and then we see that increase all the way up to 45.2% of crew members. So again, how we use this data can paint two different stories, and that's really what this class is about. It's about being able to look at the full picture to get the accurate story that the data is telling. The thing we were really examining in those past few slides was seeing, was there a relationship between a passenger's class and whether or not they survived the Titanic? And there's an important word for this, okay, and it's the concept of independence. Now, if we saw that 25% of people died regardless of their class, whether they're first, second, third, or crew class, 25% of all those classes died. And then let's say 35% of all of them survived, okay, regardless of class. Those would be independent variables, okay? It wouldn't matter what class you were in, you were just as likely to survive, you were just as likely to die, whether you were in first class or crew class. We saw that's not the case. You were a lot more likely to die as a crew member than you were in first class. So these two variables are not independent. So in other words, there is an association between these two variables because knowing something about what a passenger's class level was tells us something about whether or not they survived the sinking of the ship. All the displays we learned about, as well as their rules, can be applied to conditional distributions as well as the full data sets. Here we see them made for both the survivors and the dead for the Titanic passengers. And here we can see the differences in those two distributions and how much larger of a share the dead make up from the crew members compared to the first class passengers, which we don't see at all in that alive distribution. Lastly, if we wanted to compare two variables, this is an effective display. It's a specific kind of bar chart called a segmented bar chart. Notice that each of these bar charts totals 100%. So we have survivors and we have deceased from the Titanic, and then we just split up their class. So what percentage of first class passengers were survivors, and then over here were dead. We can see they were made up a much larger part of the survivors than they did the deceased. Okay, that's telling us that these two variables are not independent. We see the same thing from the crew members there.